Inside a quiet Tokyo taxi garage, just before sunrise, I watched a 430,000-mile engine idle smoother than cars a fraction of its age. No carbon cleanings, no injector replacements, just one simple habit Japanese drivers follow that prevents carbon buildup before it ever starts. That moment changed how I look at engines forever. Today, I'm revealing that habit, why it works so well, and why ignoring it quietly destroys fuel economy, power, and engine life without warning. On October 3, 2019, just after dusk in a narrow service alley behind a taxi depot in Osaka, I watched something that quietly broke one of the most common assumptions drivers make about engines. A compact sedan rolled in with over 380,000 kilometers on the odometer. It was not babied. It was not special. It spent its life idling in traffic, crawling through heat, stopping and starting hundreds of times a day. Back home, that mileage usually comes with excuses. It is normal. Carbon buildup. That is just age. But this engine did not sound old. The idle was calm. Throttle response was sharp. No hesitation. No roughness. No smell of unburned fuel. Nothing that suggested the slow internal decay we have been trained to expect. What struck me was not that the engine was clean, it was that no one there seemed impressed by it. Carbon buildup is treated very differently depending on where you live. In most countries, it is considered unavoidable, a side effect of modern engines, something you deal with later when symptoms finally appear. Rough idle, poor fuel economy, cold start misfires. Then comes the cleaning, chemical services, walnut blasting, expensive procedures justified by the phrase, "These engines just do this." But standing there in that garage, it became clear that this entire mindset was backwards. Carbon is not an event, it is a process. And most engines do not suffer from carbon because of bad design or bad luck. They suffer because nothing interrupts that process early enough. Modern engines are a perfect environment for carbon to form. High combustion temperatures, direct injection sprays fuel straight into the cylinder instead of over the intake valves. Short trips never allow a full heat soak. Hot shutdowns bake residue onto metal surfaces. None of this is unusual. It is normal driving, and that is exactly the problem. Every time you shut the engine off, a microscopic amount of fuel remains at the injector tip or on internal surfaces. The lighter components evaporate. What is left behind is heavier hydrocarbon residue, sticky and invisible and insignificant at first. One shutdown does not matter. 10 do not matter. But thousands of heat cycles later, those residues polymerize. They harden. They turn into varnish. Then, carbon forms. The reason most drivers never notice this happening is because nothing fails dramatically. The engine does not stall. There is no warning light. Instead, the engine control unit adapts. It sees combustion is not as efficient as it used to be, so it adds fuel and it adjusts timing. It compensates. The car still feels fine. It starts and it drives. It just quietly burns more fuel and builds more deposits. That is why carbon buildup is so misunderstood. By the time the driver feels something is wrong, the engine has been compensating for years. Carbon did not suddenly appear. It was allowed to accumulate layer by layer without resistance. In many places, carbon is treated like dirt, something you scrape off or dissolve once it becomes a problem. That belief fuels an entire industry built around reactive cleaning. Services are sold after symptoms appear. Aggressive chemicals are introduced late in the engine life. Mechanical blasting procedures restore performance, but they also carry risk. The underlying assumption is that carbon buildup is inevitable, and prevention is either impossible or unnecessary. But that assumption collapses the moment you look at how high-mileage engines behave in Japan. What shocked me that evening was not a special product or a secret machine. It was the lack of urgency. No one talked about clogged injectors or dirty valves like ticking time bombs. Carbon was not feared. It was expected. And because it was expected, it was managed long before it became destructive. The mindset was simple and almost boring. Deposits will form unless we stop them early, so the system is designed to never let them harden. This is where the cultural split happens. In much of the world, maintenance is reactive. You wait for a symptom, then fix it. In Japan, maintenance is preventative to the point of being mundane. Carbon buildup is treated the same way you treat plaque on teeth. You do not wait until there is pain. You do not attack it violently once a year. You deal with it gently and consistently so it never becomes a problem worth talking about. That philosophy changes everything about how engines age. Another thing became clear as I listened to the mechanic explain their approach. They did not talk about saving power or chasing performance. They talked about stability, predictable combustion, consistent fuel trims, engines that do not drift away from their original behavior. That is why these cars feel different at high mileage. Not because parts do not wear, but because combustion quality never degrades enough to force the engine control unit into constant compensation. When combustion stays clean, everything downstream stays healthier. Oil stays cleaner. Exhaust temperatures stay controlled. Valves seal longer. Catalytic converters live easier lives. Aging slows down. Most drivers never connect carbon buildup to this chain reaction because they only see the final symptom: poor miles per gallon, rough idle, a warning light. They assume that is when the problem starts. But the real damage happened long before that moment, quietly and invisibly, during thousands of normal shutdowns and restarts. Carbon did not sneak up on the engine. It was invited in through neglect. Standing there in that garage, watching a high-mileage taxi idle like a car a quarter of its age, one question became impossible to ignore. If carbon buildup can be prevented before it starts, if engines don't have to slowly lose efficiency as mileage climbs, then why is this treated like an unavoidable problem everywhere else? And more importantly, what exactly are Japanese drivers doing differently that allows carbon to be destroyed before it ever becomes destructive? That's the question we need to answer next, because the habit itself is simple. But understanding why it works, and why it's rarely taught, changes how you think about engine longevity forever. To understand why the Japanese habit works, you have to stop thinking about carbon buildup as dirt, and start thinking about it as chemistry in slow motion. Carbon does not appear all at once. It forms in stages, and each stage has a window where it can be stopped with almost no effort. Miss that window and everything becomes harder, riskier, and more expensive. Every combustion event leaves residue behind. Even in a perfectly running engine, combustion is never 100% complete. Microscopic amounts of fuel and oil vapor survive the explosion and cling to hot metal surfaces. Injectors, intake valves, piston crowns, ringlands, EGR passages. These surfaces are exposed to extreme heat, pressure, and oxygen. When the engine is running, airflow and fuel wash help keep things relatively clean. The real damage happens after shutdown. When you turn the engine off, heat has nowhere to go. Temperatures spike locally. The lighter fractions of fuel evaporate instantly. What is left behind are heavier hydrocarbons that do not burn cleanly. They oxidize. They polymerize. They become sticky. At this stage, they are not carbon yet. They are soft deposits. Varnish. This is the most critical moment in the entire process, because soft deposits are easy to deal with. Once they harden into carbon, they are not. Most engines outside Japan spend years living in this soft deposit stage without intervention. Drivers take short trips. They shut the engine down hot, they restart cold, over and over. Each cycle adds a microscopic layer. The ECU compensates just enough to keep the engine feeling normal. Fuel trims creep upward, timing nudges back. The driver notices nothing, but chemically, the engine is drifting toward a point where compensation is no longer enough. The Japanese habit exists specifically to interrupt this stage. The core idea is not to clean carbon, it is to prevent soft deposits from ever becoming hard deposits. That distinction is everything. Once carbon hardens, aggressive methods are required to remove it. Solvents have to be strong. Mechanical action becomes necessary. Risk increases. But if deposits are softened continuously, they never reach that stage. They dissolve gradually, harmlessly, almost invisibly. This is where chemistry matters, and not all fuel detergents are equal. Most off-the-shelf cleaners rely on light solvents that burn off quickly. They may clean injectors slightly, but they rarely survive long enough to affect deposit formation on high-temperature surfaces. The Japanese method relies on one specific class of detergent because it behaves differently under heat: polyethyramine, PEA. PEA does not flash off early in the combustion cycle. It remains stable at high temperatures. That means it reaches injector tips, intake valves, and combustion chambers intact. But it does not act like a hammer. It does not blast deposits loose. It works slowly. It bonds to carbon precursors and soft varnish, breaking their structure over multiple heat cycles. Think of it less like scrubbing and more like dissolving. This is why timing and frequency matter more than strength. Japanese technicians do not wait until fuel economy collapses or misfires appear. They introduce a properly dosed PEA cleaner while deposits are still soft before carbon forms. That way the detergent never has to fight hardened material. It just keeps surfaces from crossing the line into damage. Another critical difference is restraint. In many places, drivers treat additives like emergency medicine, something you dump in once a year or only when something feels wrong. That approach almost guarantees disappointment. If deposits are already hardened, gentle chemistry feels ineffective. So drivers double dose, mix products, and chase results. That is when seals swell, combustion destabilizes, and people conclude that additives do not work. Japanese practice avoids all of that by design. One cleaner, one dose, one tank. Then stop. Let the chemistry work across dozens of normal driving cycles. No stacking, no shortcuts, no impatience. The goal is not dramatic change. The goal is no change at all. The result is engines that feel the same at 50,000 kilometers and 250,000 kilometers because combustion quality never degrades. This also explains why the method works so well while driving. There is no downtime, no disassembly, and no shock to the system. The engine cleans itself under real operating conditions. Temperatures rise and fall naturally, load varies, and airflow behaves normally. That is exactly what injectors and valves are designed for. Cleaning becomes part of normal operation, not a violent interruption. As deposits soften and dissolve gradually, the engine control unit begins to relax. Fuel trims move closer to zero. Timing advances back toward optimal. Exhaust temperatures stabilize. Oil contamination slows because less unburned fuel washes past the rings. Catalytic converters receive cleaner exhaust. Everything downstream benefits quietly. Drivers do not feel a sudden transformation. They feel a car that stops getting worse. One of the most interesting side effects of this habit is what it reveals. Once carbon no longer masks problems, other issues become visible. A weak ignition coil shows itself. A lazy oxygen sensor stops hiding behind rich compensation. A dirty throttle body becomes obvious. Some drivers panic when this happens. They think the cleaner caused new problems. It did not. It removed the fog and allowed the engine to operate honestly again. This is why the Japanese preventive habit feels unsettling to people used to reactive maintenance. It does not feel like fixing something. It feels like nothing is happening. And that is the point. Carbon buildup does not announce itself when it starts, so stopping it should not feel dramatic either. By the time most engines elsewhere receive attention, they are already past the easy stage. Carbon has hardened, symptoms appear, and expensive solutions follow. The Japanese approach never lets the engine get there. It assumes deposits are always trying to form and quietly dismantles them before they become destructive. Once you understand this, another question becomes unavoidable. If the habit is this simple, if the chemistry is this well understood, and if the results are so consistent, why is this method so rarely taught outside Japan? And more importantly, what happens when drivers try to copy it without understanding the discipline behind it? That is where most people get it wrong. The final piece that makes the Japanese habit work is not the product. It is the discipline around it. This is the part almost nobody talks about, and it is why the method quietly succeeds in Japan while failing everywhere else. Most drivers who hear about injector or carbon prevention immediately ask one question: which cleaner should I buy? That is already the wrong starting point. Japanese mechanics do not start with products. They start with rules. And those rules exist to prevent human behavior from ruining a good idea. The first rule is consistency over intensity. Carbon buildup is not a one-time event. It is a slow chemical drift. That means prevention must also be slow and continuous. One properly dosed treatment at a fixed interval does more than 5 aggressive cleanings done randomly. This is why Japanese schedules tend to be boringly predictable, every 5,000 to 7,000 miles. Same detergent, same concentration, same method. No experimenting. The second rule is never chase symptoms. If fuel economy suddenly drops, Japanese technicians do not immediately add more cleaner. They observe first. Has driving pattern changed? More short trips? Colder weather? Different fuel station? Carbon prevention only works when it is allowed to operate quietly in the background. The moment it becomes reactionary, people overcorrect, and that is when problems start. The third rule is, do not stack chemistry. This is where most Western drivers accidentally sabotage the entire process. Mixing detergent sounds harmless, but chemically it is unpredictable. Some additives compete for the same deposits. Others alter combustion characteristics just enough to confuse the engine control unit. Japanese practice is strict. One detergent chemistry, one bottle, one tank, then stop. Let the engine do the rest. This restraint is why seals stay healthy, spray patterns stay balanced, and combustion remains stable. More is not better. More is noise. Another critical habit that rarely gets mentioned is fuel consistency. Japanese drivers tend to refuel at the same stations and stick to the same octane unless conditions change. That stability matters. Modern engine control units learn. When fuel quality swings constantly, the engine is forced to adapt continuously. That adaptation masks early deposit formation and makes prevention less effective. Stable fuel allows stable learning, which allows small chemical interventions to work properly. There is also an environmental reality most people overlook. Japanese driving conditions are brutal in a very specific way. Dense cities, short trips, frequent shutdowns, high heat soak. If carbon prevention did not work there, it would not work anywhere. The fact that taxis, delivery vans, and commuter cars survive those conditions for hundreds of thousands of miles without chronic injector or intake issues is not accidental. It is proof that the habit works under stress, not just in ideal highway scenarios. One of the most powerful outcomes of this method is psychological. Drivers stop fearing mileage. They stop associating higher odometer numbers with inevitable decline. When combustion stays clean, engines age linearly instead of exponentially. Wear still happens, but it happens slowly and predictably. That predictability is what separates cars that feel trustworthy at 200,000 miles from cars that feel tired at 120,000. This also explains why the habit feels invisible. There is no dramatic before and after moment, no sudden horsepower gain, no instant miracle. What disappears instead is degradation. The car does not suddenly feel better. It simply never gets worse. That is hard to sell. That is hard to market. And that is why this habit never spread aggressively outside Japan. Industries thrive on fixing problems, not preventing them. A fuel system that never degrades does not need services. No injector cleaning upsells. No intake teardowns. No emergency diagnostics triggered by rough idle or poor miles per gallon. Prevention does not generate panic, and panic is profitable. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Once you apply this habit correctly and consistently, you do not just protect injectors. You protect everything connected to combustion. Pistons run cleaner, rings seal better, oil stays healthier, catalytic converters live longer, oxygen sensors see cleaner exhaust. The entire system operates closer to its original design state for far longer than most people believe possible. This is also why the habit exposes weak components instead of hiding them. Clean combustion removes compensation. If something is failing, it shows itself clearly. That is not a downside. That is clarity. It allows targeted repairs instead of guesswork. Engines maintained this way do not fail suddenly. They communicate early. And that brings us to the final and most important distinction. This Japanese habit does not fix engines. It prevents engines from ever entering the failure pathway most drivers assume is inevitable. It shifts ownership from reactive to deliberate, from surprise to control. If your car has 40,000 miles and you adopt this habit, you may never experience classic injector-related symptoms at all. If your car has 80,000 or even 120,000 miles and has not been abused, this method can still slow further damage dramatically. But it only works if you respect the discipline behind it. Same chemistry, correct dose, consistent interval. Then leave it alone. Carbon buildup does not need to be fought. It needs to be interrupted early, gently, and repeatedly. That is the Japanese insight most people miss. And once you understand that, you stop asking, how do I clean carbon? You start asking, how do I make sure it never forms? That single shift in thinking is why some engines quietly reach 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles without drama, while others slowly bleed efficiency, money, and confidence long before that. If this changed the way you think about fuel systems, stay with the channel. The next breakdown exposes another everyday habit that quietly decides whether an engine ages gracefully or starts falling apart long before its time.